And there we go. And give it just a second before, we'll give it another 10 seconds before it shows up on the YouTube site. So give us a reset.
Will you say go when it shows up on the YouTube site?
Just a second before.
We'll find out.
I guess.
So I'm going to say go now.
Excellent. Here we are. Yeah, there we go. Welcome, everybody who's tuning in from home. I'm Jessica Gaetano Johansson for Lighthouse, and I'm just super excited and really, really pleased to be able to welcome you tonight to this event. So we'll be talking about a book that we've been very excited about at Lighthouse for a while now. And we actually had a book group session about it a while ago. So it was towards the end of last year, I think, when we had our Future Generations book groups. And we talked about Breaks by Julietta Singh. And Julietta actually joined us for a little bit of that book group. And it was just like half an hour or so, but it was just such a wonderful conversation and so many questions that we could have continued to talk about for a really long time. So I'm really delighted that you were able to join us again, Julietta. Welcome from all the way across the ocean.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, Jess, especially to you for all the orchestration, to Myri for teching us into existence together.
Yes, we are here.
To the bookshop, which has been such a great support of the book, and I really appreciate it. And I'm very much hoping to be with you in body and person soon.
Yeah, well, we're just saying, like, one day we will do this live for sure.
Yeah.
So just a few words. Yes, exactly. So just a few words about how this will, what we'll do. So I was rereading the breaks, and I was thinking about how to sort of structure a conversation around it that doesn't, or at least tries not to diminish it, because one of the things that I love about it is the way that it is so broad ranging and cohesive at the same time. So which is why I asked you, Julietta, if we could do two readings, if we could at least, help folks kind of get an idea of the different aspects of the book. Yeah. So I think that's what we'll do. And roughly, we talked about maybe starting with ideas of heritage, and then towards the end, or at the latter half, talking a little bit more about the future. So past and future is kind of the trajectory that we were thinking about. Sure. And I should say as well that for you who are watching, you're watching on the website, the Lighthouse website, and there is a chat tab. So you're very welcome to just ask questions or comments at any time. And then Myri will feed those through to us when we open up for questions towards the end. But you can ask the questions at any time. So you don't have to like hold on to them or write them down on a notebook. You can just chuck them into the chat. So yeah, let's get started. And I think, should we start with a reading, Julietta?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to say thank you to you again, because I really love doing events and readings and in conversations where my interlocutor, in this case you, selects readings for me and helps to kind of think through what's most interesting and valuable to you about the book. I admit that I never really know what people are going to be excited about or interested in particular. So these are your curations, and I really appreciate having that guidance and thoughtfulness put into us coming together in conversation. So the readings are actually not going to be chronological. We're starting sort of midway through the book, and then we're backing up closer to the beginning.
I realized that after I sent you the email.
It's a non-chronological text, so it really works.
Yeah, absolutely. I quite like that.
Okay, so I'll read just a couple of pages. In their edited collection, Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, Democratic Futures, M. Jackie Alexander and Chandra Talpad Mohanty write, "We were not born women of color, but rather became women of color in the context of grappling with indigenous racisms within the United States and the insidious patterns of being differently positioned as Black and brown women." I felt for the first time in this collaborative feminist provocation the possibility of another world, a form of solidarity that not only bridged Black and Brown feminisms, but positioned Indigenous erasures at the forefront of its politics. I was besotted by the idea of becoming a woman of color, in part because so much of my early life had been spent wishing away the lived experience of brownness. There was a choice here, a process of emergence by which I could metamorphize within the very same skin. Global feminisms allowed me to sense and feel my brownness anew, and in contact with those brilliant intellectual sisters and aunties, I too became a woman of color. I emerged as a body that lived into rather than against its difference. And so, while I had grown up with disdain for my racialized body, by the time I was growing you, I desired nothing more than to hold and to be held by communities of color. I return to this profound transformation often in your youth, watching you angle toward my body as I once desperately clamored toward my mother's. It's the same maternal love extending across generations, and it is also crucially different. You assert your unwavering love for the whole of me, not in difference, but in likeness. You see yourself in and as my body, my belly, your first home, my flesh, the landscape of your intimacy. We have been shaped differently by and through race, you and I, and this produces in me an extraordinary feeling of joy. From the very start of your life, your racial ambiguity has, like mine, hovered in the social sphere. The first time your father took you out into the world without me, a man approached you both curiously and asked, "Where is she from?" In contrast to your father's blonde hair and blue eyes, you were read by the stranger as a foreign body, a child brought from elsewhere. Unaccustomed to navigating race from the other side, Nathan was initially affronted by the question. He came home angry, a feeling that was, at its core, his first parental worry over your future sense of social belonging. "Did you tell him she came from the womb?" I asked. Then we chuckled, renaming my womb your elsewhere of origin. Though you are lighter skinned than me, you identify with brownness infinitely more than I could as a girl your age. Once, you were welcomed into the fold of whiteness when a friend on the playground insisted you could be white like her. You came home and admitted your bewilderment over this strange form of welcome. I described the stranglehold of race and racism, how lighter-skinned bodies hold more currency in the global economy, and I told you that your friend's insistence was in fact an attempt to situate herself in relation to other bodies. I explained that lighter-skinned brown people are more easily digested by the white mainstream, that your friend's invitation was an illustration of the power of dominant bodies to tell you what and who you are, to situate your mixed body as they see fit. And I told you there and then that regardless of how your body is read by the world around you, you are and will always be brown, not only because of the color of your skin, but because brownness is the unequivocal orientation of your maternal education.
Thank you so much. Oh, I love that section so much. It makes me happy. So
I don't think I've ever read that section out loud. So
have you not?
It's
just beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I remember underlining it the first time I read the book and had a similar reaction this time around, just kind of coming into it and just one of those moments of, I think landing is the right word, when you sort of just feel like you land in a text.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of start talking about brownness and the experience of mixedness by asking you about a few points in the book. You mentioned the fact that so much about racial narratives, particularly in the US where you live now, is fundamentally built on a binary, on a racial binary, and that kind of leaves brown people and mixed people chafing and in a very kind of volatile space, definition wise. And I just I've got two questions really. One of them is, do you see any, because you grew up in Canada, so have you experienced any difference in terms of that binary in Canada and in the US? And also, like, in a broader sense, what kind of influence do you think that, like, simplifying, saying US narrative around race has in the world at large?
Let's start with the first question, and then you can jog me on the second one.
Will do.
So, I write in the book a little bit about growing up. I grew up in central Canada in Winnipeg, on Treaty 1 territory, and I grew up with a very visible, immediate presence of Indigenous peoples in the world that I lived in, and for the most part, my exposure to Indigenous peoples was an exposure of systemic abuse and poverty. And so I grew up within a visual discourse and a political discourse that really was trying to and quite failing at thinking about brownness as indigeneity. And my father, who's an immigrant from India, was one of the first waves of Indian immigrants to come to Canada. And really, he's passed away now, but I think really suffered from the experience of a moment of immigration when there were so few Indian immigrants and racialized immigrants from elsewhere, that he felt very deeply his exploitation. And also it was, the 60s and 70s when the sort of dominant logic was toward assimilation, and assimilation as a very violent psychological and material process. So I think for me, I grew up with a sense of alienation because in Winnipeg, it was a very white place in the 80s of my childhood. But at the same time, there was this brown presence of Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that's so striking now is that when I returned to Winnipeg as an adult, having not lived there for a long time, 20 some odd years, that I returned to a very different visual landscape. And it's kind of incredible to see how palpably and immediately various kinds of brownness are in circulation in that space in ways that I didn't have access to or I didn't see as much as a child. And so one of the differences is I moved to the US in my mid-20s from Canada, having done a couple of degrees in Canada, and then came for my education in the US, and felt very jolted by, I think as people often do when you immigrate from one place to another and the racial discourses are so differently shaped. And in the United States, for very understandable reasons at the level of a history of enslavement in the country and the country's origins, that is settler colonial origins, having been built on the backs of enslaved peoples, that the discourse here is very split and very fractured between a Black and white America. And what's interesting is that indigeneity pretty much drops out of any kind of mainstream discourse in a way that it's very present in Canada. So, which is not to elevate Canada. Canada has an incredibly systemically abusive relationship to its Indigenous peoples, but nobody in Canada doesn't have an awareness of indigeneity or an education that understands the brutal, more or less understands the brutal origins of settler colonialism in Canada. And in the US, it's pretty absent from an educational program here, K through kindergarten through 12 education systems. Students really don't learn it. And if they learn it through a very happy narrative of Indigenous peoples welcoming the settlers and working in harmony with them without telling the sort of extraordinarily, unbelievably violent history of what settler colonialism and settler colonialists did to Indigenous peoples. So it's sharp, and I think in the sort of weight of America's Black and white racial discourse, you have a very large Mexican population in the country, you have all kinds of other racialized immigrants, and you have a very significant body of Indigenous peoples that aren't really attended to within that binary discourse. That's the first part.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of, gone into the second part of my question a wee bit, because what that made me wonder is, obviously it makes you think about what the racial discourse is in every place that one has experience of, and how different it is. But somewhere in there, there's also the fact that the US as a cultural empire has a huge power. So it sort of made me wonder how that binary influences the way we talk about race, like in other places.
Everywhere else. Yeah, absolutely. And for me, we didn't mention at the start of my reading, and I almost stopped to say so, but because the book is penned as a letter to my young daughter, it was really an attempt to help to situate her within this binary landscape through which she essentially disappears, but also feels all the time the force of whiteness and the alienation of racialization, and yet doesn't have a place within those two poles.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about, sort of moving on from that to a little bit more about belonging, really. There's a wonderful bit where you describe really movingly, in a way that I found kind of personally, like, just intensely related to, how you've never really felt like this immediate belonging or this strong belonging to a place. That's not kind of how belonging happens for you. So I wondered, if belonging isn't tied to place, where do you feel your most or how do you feel your most intense sense of belonging?
This is a good question. I mean, I definitely think in the narrative of the breaks, that intense belonging is really through queer family making and otherwise orientations outside of the sort of mainstream culturally acceptable ways in which we're taught to understand family as culture or heritage or bloodlines and certain legible genealogies. And I think the breaks is really a reflection of an experiment in family making that's much more about close reading and being in relation to each other for no other reason but the reason of being willing to open ourselves to each other and read each other carefully and textually and non-masterfully, which is to say, like, there's a moment when I write about my queer best friend and co-parent Nathan in the book where I'm writing about having a relationship with him where for the first time in my life I really feel a kind of unbreakable relation when I come from so many historical and filial forms of breaking, and that there's something to me so powerful and so interesting about forging those bonds with others that are not subject to the kinds of conventional forms of breaking and not subject to those conventional forms of breaking precisely because we're committed close readers of each other. And when I say close reading, what I mean is like treating each other as texts and as sites of interpretation, where as the reader, you're never in a position of mastery or authority, but actually ever changing and ever unfolding in relation to what it is that you're reading. And so I'm really trying to think in this book and in my life beyond it around a kind of pedagogy and a kind of study that is family making.
I mean, that
and
makes
there's
me
also
think.
lots to say, Jess, about place, and we should talk more about place because I know that you also have this sort of diasporic, like I'm from all these places and nowhere at the same time, right? And so there's
no, exactly. And one of the things that it sort of followed on from that it made me wonder, there's this bit in the book where your daughter is, well, I think you're standing in front of this house and your daughter has got like this vision of basically collective living where, all these people are going to move in and there's going to be food all like for everyone. And it's just going to be this like incredibly caring home that is not
village.
That is not built around a nuclear family. And what that made me wonder is, in a future where that is more geared toward the collective rather than the nuclear family, what does that automatically also make it more local? Is sort of one thing that I'm wondering about. And also, you know, going back to what we were saying about like diasporic families and transnational identities, is what sort of break would that mean if we do become more local in terms of our identities as, you know, just transnational identities, I suppose, of like belonging a bit everywhere?
I don't, you know, I think it's an interesting question, because I don't see there being a tension between those poles. Like, in part of it is the question of what it means to be local, like how we conceive of the local and how we conceive of the global. So if we abide by my daughter's extraordinary vision that I fail to realize, which is like, essentially, what if we open our doors and change the way that we live in space to allow others who don't have homes to come in and share the space with us? What if we do this? And, you know, she has this whole vision for how she can accomplish it. It means that people who arrive at our door are allowed through the door, right? And it doesn't really matter. It's local in the sense of here's where we're positioned, but it doesn't really matter where those people arrive from. So I think that there's something interesting about like what it means to be acting locally, which is to say, to be where you are and to be acting from where you are, but toward another kind of world, or the making of another kind of world. And I think that has something interesting to do with place. Like there's a moment in the breaks, and, you know, every time you write a book, you let it go, but you also live with it. And the way that you live with it is often through a return of like, I should have, because your thoughts are always developing, right? And it's not like, I don't mean it in the facile sense of like, I wish I had used a different word, or I wish I had, but really because when you're writing as an act of figuring out what world you want, it's always a work in progress, and it stops somewhere because you publish it, but your life goes on trying to figure that thing out. And there's something for me about the breaks where, you know, and it's not that old, so I haven't had that much time. I think it came out in September or October, but there's to me something about thinking through place and the question of belonging that you started with, which is like, what does it mean to belong to a place? And I think that there's something, and, you know, I'm here in a settler colony, having to think about what it means to belong as an immigrant to a place I clearly don't belong to. I wasn't born here. Even the place that I was born, I don't belong to, in the sense that it's stolen land. So what does it ever mean to belong? And I think that question of belonging for me is a really interesting and productive one, because I think from a philosophical perspective, I really like Braiding Sweetgrass's move to say, like, what if we all just become native to the places that we are? Like, what if we just begin to understand the ecology of wherever we are at whatever time, and really like sink into that land and become part of that land? I love that formulation, but I also think that there's something interesting about migrancy, immigrant statuses, and political and social unbelonging that can actually make unbelonging a really interesting and generative form of thinking. So this is something I don't write so much about in the breaks, but have been thinking about a lot in the aftermath. Like, what happens if we understand that we actually don't belong to this place? And instead of, you know, in the US and maybe especially Canada, there's a lot of language of like, I'm a guest on X, Y, or Z lands. But what if we thought less along the lines of, you know, I'm a guest, to thinking, or an uninvited guest, as is often the term, but to thinking about what it means to be in a place that is not organic to you and is not yours, but to which you might become consequential to anyways.
Yeah. There's something really important about presence there, isn't it? And about constantly kind of expanding connections, I suppose. And I was going to ask this later, but I'm going to ask it now. And it might seem like a jump, but somehow in my brain it isn't. We'll see. And it's about, we haven't mentioned the bodily breaks. In the breaks, and in your history of injury and of surgery. And you mention, and you describe in the book how, it becomes very clear that someone's medical history, as in the history that is written by a medical institution, is different from their own knowledge of their body. And you describe how you sort of almost had to trust your own history at one point because there weren't enough answers. And I wondered, looping back to what we were talking about earlier, if there is a way that this trust in one's own body can actually influence one's trust in a wider ecology or in a wider place, and just seeing what is clearly wrong or how a place changes and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally fascinating question and such a smart connection with the book. But, there's an interesting way in which I had written this book before the breaks called No Archive Will Restore You, that was very much a weird, queer, experimental body memoir. And part of that body memoir was trying to think about the ways in which we're so socialized into a relation to the body that doesn't understand the body at all, and that is committed to a disciplinary relation to it, a very self and other policing relationship to it, whether we're talking about race or size or gender or what have you, or disability, that we don't really have that intuitive sense of our bodies anymore. Here's a really silly example. I went to the doctor 2 days ago because I've been having a problem with my knee, which is related to all the other body problems I have, which are inexhaustible. But she said, what happens when you bend your knee like this? What happens, she's doing all these tests on my knee and taking x-rays. And she simply said, why don't you, for 6 weeks, not do the thing that makes it hurt? And I was like, oh, just try to not do the thing that makes it hurt. It's intuitive. Obviously, you should not do the thing that makes it hurt, right? But we're so driven in relation to our bodies toward a certain kind of functionality, a certain kind of mobility. And even having written a book about how bullshit it is that we don't understand it, I still, you write the book precisely because you don't get it, and you're not
done with it.
You're not done with it. And so, I think of the body always as something that is always something that I'm learning and trying to learn differently and toward, but also pretty far from the mark at times. And, it's funny to think about the breaks. I mean, I'm not sure if we talked about this before, Jess, but I was really determined not to write about the body in the breaks. And
I think you mentioned it actually.
I really was like, I wrote No Archive Will Restore You, and that's enough about the body, and it's definitely enough about my body. Pretty done with that. But what a ridiculous thing to think when you're writing a letter to your daughter, and not at the level of biology, but at the level of landscape. For my daughter, my body is her home. So this comes back to belonging. For my daughter, my body is the primary site of her belonging, and not because she came from it, but because I love her with it, and she is loved by it. Yeah. So there's something so interesting about, even there, that split from the body, or that desire to move away from it, instead of understanding it not only as a landscape, but as a very intimate part of the broader landscapes and ecologies that we live in.
I mean, it's so interesting that there was that, okay, I'm done with this now. Moving on to something else, because
I shock myself sometimes with my own stupidity.
And I think it happens very, very easily. And I also wonder if there's something in there about, when I described your book at the beginning of the event about the wanting to classify things, that is like, this is my book about the body and this is my book about this, that comes from somewhere, you know, that isn't necessarily like the organic way to think about stuff. Should we do another reading?
Absolutely. Yes. Now I can't remember what the second selection was. I have it marked, but I don't remember what it is.
It'll be a surprise.
Oh yes, I know what it is now. Okay. So again, I'll read just a little bit more than I read last time. I am turning over questions I cannot yet answer. Against political and corporate systems that are plunging us full speed toward total ecological destruction, what will ultimately make our bodies gather and surge against them? Will we physically revolt against these systems, using our collective might to raise them to the ground? Or will we find another way to exercise our willful bodies in resistance? Can we withdraw ourselves en masse, bodies and minds, refusing to feed a system that thrives on our habits and labor, our lifestyles, our instilled consumptive desires? Marx once predicted that the bourgeoisie would never be the source of a class revolution because they had too much to lose. They would cling to their property and the forms of individual freedom they held so dear. History has shown us that few of us who benefit from the order of things are willing to compromise what we have for the good of the whole. If a class revolution was to come, Marx foresaw, it would have to come from the proletariat, the underclasses who had little to lose, who in having little to lose would have the impetus to change the course of history. The revolution, in other words, was not going to come from people like me. But shouldn't the immediate threat of human extinction trump the Marxist formulation of class revolution? Shouldn't knowing that extinctions are everywhere underway lead us to demolish the effacing forces that produce it? Regardless of class status, shouldn't the very fact of being your mother mean I am already sharpening my knives, fighting tooth and nail for our lives? In Lose Your Mother, Saidiya Hartman chronicles her journey to the African motherland, a journey that turns out to be less a homecoming than a series of discomforting estrangements. Hartman's journey provokes us to consider the critically incomplete and sometimes even false stories of our pasts, urging us to think otherwise about our inheritances. Every generation confronts the task of choosing its past, she writes. Inheritances are chosen as much as they are passed on. I think of you each time I read these words. Think of all we know about our history and all that has been omitted. Think of what you will choose from the past in pursuit of a future we might yet survive. I think also of the role of the mother and of losing her in the political act of culling from history and discarding what does not serve you. For as unabashedly attached as we are, I accept that you will need to loosen our bond as you make your way in the world. I'm not squeamish about this developmental loosening. I know that we must lose our mothers, only often later, and in a perverse twist, to become them in ways we may not be able to predict or appreciate. It is less the inevitability of our break than it is the shape and force of it that haunts me. I know it is not just me you will need to break from, but the entire way of life that I represent. However liberally filled with reused plastic bags, farmers market purchases, and composting practices, this form of life is ushering us and everyone else toward the end of the world. More than any other time in history, what you choose from the past will need to be meticulously studied and selected. You'll need to read beyond the official archives with a keen understanding that resistance, collective action, and stories of survival against all odds have been discarded by the grand narratives of history. You will need to cull carefully from the intimate and political pasts that have shaped your life, and you will need to draw respectfully from other histories of subjugation that are not yours, but have had no less a hand in shaping you. You'll need to discover and learn from these fragments, from ancient stories and lost practices, from the hints and traces of lives lived otherwise, from forms of resistance already underway that are not yet perceptible to you. If, following Hartman, inheritances are as much chosen as they are passed on, I feel urgently compelled to offer myself to you in all my complicity and failure, inviting you to pick and choose from your maternal history what is important for you in the service of ongoing human life. What you will discover is a history of insufficiencies, of nearly unbelievable forms of denial, of living much more with than against the violently consumptive status quo. I hope that in sifting through my past, you might also stumble on obscured moments that lead you nearer to an elsewhere. Losing me, my way of life, is unquestionably a requisite to survival and futurity. Yet I hope with every thread of my being that this world-altering shift can become a form of breaking that does not sever us entirely or wrench us into mutual unbelonging. My most intimate desire is that you find a way to break with me rather than to break from me. A desire in which the necessity of our breaking does not so much leave me behind in your struggle to survive as it does invite me in and calls me to blaze alongside you. I yearn for our imminent break to be not an end, but an act of profound and collective renewal. In these early years of your life, I whisper to you a mantra in your sleep with the passionate hope that it will embolden you. Break with me, break with me, break with me.
Thank you. It just sort of struck me that, because I've heard you read that excerpt before. Have you read it quite a few times, that one? Is that one that you have read a bit?
I think so, yeah. It's one I have read. It sort of sets the frame because it's earlier on. It does,
yeah.
So I often read from the earlier pages in the book to sort of contextualize for folks what it is I'm doing in the book.
Well, it just struck me because it ends with this mantra that reading it again and again must also feel, yeah, there's something quite active about that, about putting that out in the world again and again. Do the words feel different as time goes by? I mean, it's not been a long time, but just the repetition of it, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think as is the case with many readings and rereadings of your own work, it's easy to fall into a kind of rhythm or pattern with it that's a little bit unlike reading other people's work. So, as a literature professor, I'm always having these kind of magical experiences where I've taught a book 20 times, okay, maybe not 20 times, but several times over, and I'll be reading something aloud and I'll notice something for the first time that really, blows me away. And I think one of the differences of reading your own work is that you're busy in the sort of performativity of it. So you're less with the language. And I think, probably in the early days of reading Break With Me, that passage in particular, I probably felt a little bit more emotional. And this is a very maybe boring and truthful answer,
it can go both ways at the same time, I suppose, really quite unexpectedly.
Yeah, I also wonder, it's the question is, what will it feel like when that break has actually happened? What will it feel like when my child is 20 and that time has passed in a way that it, and it's interesting too, because time has already passed. My kid just turned 10, and at moments in this book she's 3, and at moments in the book she's 7, and so that there's also a wide, she's so many different versions of herself across this book, and so many different versions of herself now, and it's an interesting reflection on how I'm also so many different versions of myself. From now and the time that I wrote the book, or the time that it was published, or the time that I was, the time when she was 3, myself 7 years ago, or what have you.
Yeah. Something else that I thought about with reading that expert, and actually at other points in the book, is, you mentioned how actually, one of the things that I have told people about when I've talked about this book is I've been find myself being very keen to say, this isn't a letter of apology, because I feel like there is that narrative hovering somewhere. If you are talking about where we are heading as a species and you are talking to a new generation, that there is that kind of, I guess, just guilt, really. And you even say at one point that you have to move beyond the urge to apologize.
I think that's the paragraph right after Break With Me. I think the last paragraph. It's like, I've moved beyond the urge to apologize to you. Yeah,
exactly. And I do find that so powerful, and wanted to hear more about, just hone in on that process, I suppose, because it seems to me that that's another break, not necessarily like between you and your daughter, but actually a break in, or a shedding of something in order to kind of be able to move forward. And it also, I would imagine that it's not a very linear thing, like grief isn't linear. I would imagine that leaving guilt behind isn't linear either. So I wanted to hear more about how that has happened for you.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to jump in and steer me, because it's a big question, and I probably have more to say than we have time to
It is a big question. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. But if I'm going in directions and you want to steer me back, please jump in. I think, the first thing to say is I'm not sure that it's not that I don't have guilt about the life that we're living and the world that we live in, but I think guilt isn't the most productive of emotions for the most part. And I think the mainstream narrative, I mean, so much of the book, I think there's a way of reading the book as a kind of like at every turn counter to mainstream narratives, which happens when your mom's a gender studies and diaspora professor. But I think that there's something really interesting to me about thinking about the mainstream logics. I mean, even the very liberal mainstream logics are always wedded to like, we have to think about the next generation. We have to think about our grandchildren. Like, this is really the discourse. And it's interesting because that discourse is sutured to a kind of guilt, right? A future projected, like, you are damaging the world for your own people to come. And, since I'm very invested in thinking against the conventional notions of family that we've inherited, I'm not especially interested in thinking about my own lineage and my own future generations. It doesn't really help me toward political mobilization. And so I think I'm more invested in thinking about, and this is going to get us into like a heady conversation about the past, the present, and the future, but I think about the future as now, which is to say, and I like get very like woo-woo here, but but also just like non-modern notions of time, which are, much more circular, much more about turning and returning than about this like steady progress. And I think that narrative of the future is exactly the strange narrative of capitalism, like, that can't understand how it's devouring itself along the way. That if we just keep going and keep going and keep going on this wildly exploitative train that we're on, this global system of exploitation of people and animals and the earth, that we're like advancing in some progressive way, but we're actually really declining wildly in that advancement. And so I think it sometimes, thinking against those easy delineations of time is helpful to thinking about the present as the future, the present as a time in which there's no, especially in the wake of ecological catastrophe that we're living in now. I really think this future that we've all been imagining is here now. And so what does it mean to treat the future as the here and now, and to understand that it's not so much, and I think this is what I was trying to convey in that reading, that it's not so much the breaking with that I'm calling for is precisely about moving away from the lives we're living now and the world that we're living in now towards something else together. So breaking from my practices in order to break with me differently. So again, it's not a logic of an inheritance in which my daughter's going to have to undo all the damage I've done, which is always just pushing it off and pushing it off, but rather really transforming the fabric and structure of our lives in the here and now and in the future, toward a really different kind of living together and collectively.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to pick up on. Just like, but I mean, one of the things that I thought of was actually like, you know, when people talk about climate justice, and I remember years ago, like being at a protest and realizing that most people who were calling for climate justice were, what they meant by that was what you were saying. It was like my grandchild. Yeah. Which I think goes into, it's a very sort of almost concrete and stark example of that idea that, you know, the future is like, yeah, weirdly biological, you know. Totally. But what I wanted to ask you about was, you know, picking up on if we move away from that and like my biological children or grandchildren, you know, I love the way that you write about not necessarily just queer families, but just use the word queer and like queer identities. One of my favorite definitions of just queerness is bell hooks, and that's not just about who you have sex with, that although that's like a part of it, but it's about the self that needs to create a space that is at odds with the world, you know, around you. And like starting with a definition like that, or with a more almost like deeply rooted queerness. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, this is a book about the future, and very often when we hear narratives about the future and acting for the future, whatever that might mean, it's almost like having children is what makes you care, you know, about the future. Yeah. So I wondered, how can queerness itself and queer family making help us, you know, create a broader connection to the future? That was a very long-winded way to get to a question.
It's great. Yeah. It's great. So maybe I can talk a little bit about it through a new project that I'm working on now, because I think it really touches on, you know, the difference between queer sexuality and something like a queer approach to life and living. And I don't want to minimize the significance of queer sexuality or conflate it. I think, you know, certainly I would agree with bell hooks that it's not just about who you have sex with, but or what kind of sex you have. But I do think that sexual economies and sexual communities are vital to queerness and always have been. So I'll just bracket that to say, you know, I'm very invested in what it means to approach our lives queerly, which is to say, in a very basic way, against the normative grain that has got us on this train. And I think I'm working on a project now that is a collaborative documentary film project with a Canadian filmmaker named Chase Joint. And Chase and I are busy working on this very strange, very experimental feature-length kind of narrative essay documentary about the history of the house that I grew up in. And the history of the house that I grew up in is incredibly interesting, because I grew up knowing it as it's a beige brick Queen Anne style Victorian mansion that was known to me in my youth as the J.B. Monk House. And my parents bought the house in 1980 for the cost of the land, because the house was in ruin. And my mom has spent the last 42 years restoring it, getting it historically designated. But the history that designates it is the history of a white colonial banker during the westward expansion of Canada, absorbing Indigenous lands. So an early Winnipeg banker who moved out west and lived in the house. but I didn't know all of the other incredible histories of the house. And so my approach then to history, which is also an approach to the present and also an approach to the future, is about really looking through not only the archives, the official archives, but through oral histories, through strange coincidences, in order to think about what I'm calling brick and mortar kinships. So what happens when we understand a place, any place, in this case, by example, my childhood home, not as a place of a national narrative, but as a place of an almost endless, incredible archive of minoritized histories. Mm-hmm. And in the case of my house, the minoritized histories are incredible. Like, I moved there as a young child, and was told very directly, we don't want your kind around here. And I discovered over the pandemic that the house was actually built by a mixed race Indigenous family, a Métis family in like early Winnipeg history in 1882. And so it totally upsets the frame of how you understand place and belonging, to return to where we started, like that I was an immigrant kid from an immigrant family with a racially mixed set of parents. And the origins of the house were never white and never colonial, but actually Indigenous. And then for a year in the 1890s, it became very temporarily the school for the deaf. So kids were like, deaf kids were educated and resided in the house. And then for 15 years after the Canadian government interned Japanese people after World War II, it became a cultural hub for the Japanese consulate. So you see, when you look against the sort of like dominant colonial narrative, these incredible other histories always moving in and out and circulating through the house. And so our project is really trying to summon the spirits of the house that are not historical, but are still there affectively, materially, spiritually, and to kind of fuck with time and to let all of these incredible feminist figures of the past, whether they be maids, whether they be deaf kids, whether they be Indigenous, like badass grannies, all coming into the house and being in the house at the same time with my very disabled 84-year-old mother who's living there now. So again, I think that's like the queer kinship question is like, what happens if I understand actually that my relationship to that particular place is a relationship in which I have a set of kinships from very different populations, very different communities that are otherwise totally siloed in the world of like stringent and narrowly defined identity politics. I don't belong to the deaf community. I don't belong to the Japanese Canadian community. I don't belong to the Métis community in Winnipeg. And yet I also do, deeply and materially and spatially and affectively. And so I'm really trying to mess with like what it means to think about kinship and what it means to think about family and what happens when we look queerly toward other forms of family making that aren't, in time, meaning like not just present, and aren't just through bloodlines or heritage or, racialized or unracialized cultures, etc.
And that just goes straight back to what you were saying about feeling belonging to a place and what that actually means. And and even the medical history and the kind of official medical history and what you feel in your body, there's a sort of connection there as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very aware that we have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna let them in because we've just talked. So
okay.
So here we go.
We're gonna just zoom in and join us.
Let's do it. Well, they're watching on the website. Otherwise that's that would be a great thing to do. So we've got a question from Sinead. Have you had any surprising reactions to the book? You mentioned resisting categories. Is there a categorization others have given the book that you reject or struggle with? Okay,
great question. I have can I give a two-pronged answer?
Go for it, always.
Okay, Sinead, thank you for the question. Okay, the surprising reaction is one that's been quite disappointing to me, actually, which is I've had a series of mums respond to the book by saying, oh, you're such a better mother than I am. Or like, I'm not doing a good enough job. And I feel really, really sad and disappointed when I get that reaction, because I actually think that the book is one way of reading the book is as a catalog of my insufficiencies. Like here, for instance, the example that you gave, Jess, of like my daughter saying like, I have this vision for what we could do with the duplex that we live in a queer family structure where my daughter's dad lives downstairs and I live upstairs, and we cohabitate queerly in this space, and she wants to open it up to a much wider field, and I say no. I don't really say no, I just sort of let it let it disappear. But I understand in the moment, like, wow, my kid has a way more interesting and capacious political sensibility than I do, and she's right, and the only reason I'm not doing it is because I am a bourgeois
there's that resistance.
Yeah, it's the resistance, is that very deeply ingrained resistance to like literally transforming the conditions of my life and our lives. So I'm always disappointed with that reaction, because I think we're all doing it wrong. and the book is trying to say, like, here are ways that I'm doing it wrong, and how can we come together and really think differently about this. So that's a disappointment. And I guess the other is, my work, this book and the book that I wrote before, No Archive Will Restore You, are often called auto theory. I don't know if that term is circulating as much in your area of the world, but it's very big in North America. To categorize.
Is this like the nonfiction version of autofiction, basically? Like
exactly. Exactly. And there was a really funny, somebody made like a snarky, funny remark at some point that auto theory is really just like professors who write memoirs, which basically means, smarty pants intellectual thought mixed with memoir, right? And I don't really have a problem with the term, but the way that it the thing that bumps for me in thinking about my own work in that categorization is that I'm always actually trying to upset the auto of the self, the individual, in order to think something much more plural and much more porous and much more interconnected. And really my academic work, including my first academic book, Unthinking Mastery, was really an attempt to undo the stability of that Enlightenment subject man that we've all inherited as like, you are the master of yourself, you are the controller and ruler of yourself, and the really disturbing logics that come from that. And all of us have really been socialized through that. And so it's a very nitpicky thing, but I always think, but I'm not an auto theorist, because I'm always trying to undo the auto. I'm always trying to undo the sort of like singular individuated entity. So those are my two answers. Thanks, Sinead.
That was such an interesting question and such an interesting answer. So we've got another question from Zayn. Are there any writers you have sought out to explore your own inheritances? Anyone you recommend? And they do love Saidiya Hartman as well.
Okay.
Big love to Saidiya Hartman.
Yeah, definitely Saidiya Hartman. I just did a really beautiful in conversation event with Natalie Diaz, who I think is on your radar, on the bookstore radar.
Which I know I watched, and I think some people who are watching this probably watched that as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot with Natalie right now, in part because I think we have some very productive tensions. Natalie is very much an Indigenous thinker, thinking with and through indigeneity. And very obviously, that's not my inheritance and not my vantage point. And it's really cool, actually, to be kind of like working through with a little bit of like very loving friction, some of the things that I'm trying to think, and some of the things that she's thinking. I should also give Nathan Snaza props, who's my co-parent, who is often half of my brain, who thinks with me a lot, who wrote a really beautiful book called Animate Literacies, that's trying to think very differently about what happens when we read, to include in the act of reading, like, what creatures are with us. There's my little dog Dosa in the background. like what sensory experiences we're having, what's happening with the body, what's happening with the atmosphere around us, to really think much more widely as about reading, not just as marks on a page that we decipher, but a whole sort of environmental surround, what he calls the literacy situation. So I've thought a lot, and I went to grad school with Nathan, so we've been thinking together for more than 15 years. So those are a couple off the cuff.
Oh, brilliant. I can, yeah, Sadia Hartman, absolutely. We've got 2 more questions. Do we? I'm aware that we're at 8 o'clock, but I'm going to throw them in because I definitely feel they deserve to be answered. So, question from Joe: I find your notion of time fascinating, and we'll be thinking on that a lot going forward. For someone who is struggling with grief about our planet and our comrades on this planet, could you share maybe one thing that gives you hope?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I had this really very tender conversation with a very young person, like a teenager, through a strange alienating Zoom portal at a literary event somewhere in middle America a couple of months ago, who was expressing like deep grief. And just, I think a lot about, I'm in my mid 40s, what it means to be a teenager, kind of as brutal and brutalizing as that time of life is, like what it means to come up in this world, where I'm already sort of like angling out. But I think, for me, I think that when you come from, it's a bit of a hard question, and I need to come up with like a nugget that I can throw out, because I wish I had something simpler to say, but what I'll say is that I think when you understand that history has always been a history of struggle, and when you come from people who have come out of those like deep and violent and often profoundly devastating histories of struggle, as I do, between the partition of the Indian subcontinent and the Holocaust, I'm pretty much stacked with modern histories of brutality. And I think when you come from that vantage point, hope is something that you understand as a kind of inheritance, and that really all you have to do in the face of that is claim it, and so I think a lot of people right now are sort of struggling with a disparity, not a disparity, with despair, struggling with despair without, and here's our the question is such a good question, because it's the past, present, and future question again, right? That we have to understand that though this is obviously an exceptional world historical moment that we're in now, that our histories and our family histories and our political histories, whatever our might be, whoever's histories that we're borrowing from, and we can say that every history is our history. Every history is a history if we're thinking on a wider scale, right? That hope has always been the motivating force of social change, and that it's something that you have to claim. So I have to think more about like how, like the how to have hope. But partially it's through looking back at the incredible struggles of the past and how we endure, how we continue to survive, and always have continued to survive.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. So something for me about when I have conversations about hope, that I think someone said that, most people don't have, can't afford not having hope. Like that hope is also something about looking around you and going, what do you put out there? Can I afford despair? No, I can't, because that sort of thing. One final question from it's not a question.
Okay. Good. Just a comment. I love ending on a comment.
We're going to end on a comment from Anita. The Breaks is one of my favorite books ever. It spoke to me on so many levels, and in particular, it was just so special and magical to read about this beautiful queer family building when there is no blueprint for it, and I feel not enough language for it. Thank you so much.
Oh, Anita, thank you. That's beautiful. What a beautiful way to end. I'm really honored to be here with you all, and I'm sorry that it's so virtual that I can't see your faces.
One day. Well, Anita's
Really-
also part of the Lighthouse family, and yeah,
Okay, great.
we've squealed a lot about the breaks over the last few months. So there you go.
And I always say, for people who don't have the words in the moment to ask questions, I'm always easily reachable through email and really welcome any reach outs in the aftermath.
Thank you for sticking around, everyone. And thank you so much, Julietta. This has just been such a joy, and gonna end the day on a high, end of the week on a high. Yeah.
Thanks for all your questions. Jess, thanks for the incredibly thoughtful conversation.